Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the world of contracts.
Okay.
But don't worry, we're not like drafting one or anything.
Yeah.
We're just going to kind of dissect one key ingredient.
Okay.
So think of it like this. You strike a deal with someone, everything seems legit, but then things go south and you realize what you thought was a done deal wasn't legally binding after all.
Right.
And the culprit, this thing called consideration.
You hit the nail on the head. Consideration is the lifeblood of any contract.
Okay.
It's that essential something that transforms a simple promise into a legally enforceable agreement.
Okay, so it's more than just a handshake in good faith.
Exactly.
Our sources define consideration as something of value given in exchange for a promise.
Right.
But this feels a little vague, doesn't it?
Sure.
What kind of something are we even talking about here?
Well, you're right. It's more nuanced than it might seem on the surface. That something can be a lot of things. Money, goods, services, or even something less tangible like a right or a promise to not do something.
Yeah. Full in. So giving something up counts too.
Yes.
It doesn't always have to be about like getting something back in return.
You got it. A classic example is the case of Hemmer v. Sidway.
Okay.
A nephew promised his uncle he'd stay away from things like drinking and gambling, vices that he was legally entitled to, in exchange for a hefty sum of money.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the nephew basically promised to be on good behavior, and the court was like, yep, that's valuable.
Exactly. The court ultimately sided with the nephew.
Wow.
And this case established a powerful precedent in, even intangible things.
Okay.
Like, your right to do something can have legal value in a contract.
Interesting.
It really highlights how detriment or giving something up can be valuable.
So in plain English, detriment basically means making a sacrifice.
Yes.
Even if it's giving up something you're allowed to do.
Precisely. And that sacrifice, that detriment,
Yeah.
is a key part of what makes a contract legally solid.
Okay.
It shows that both sides are bringing something to the table.
That's a wild twist.
Yeah.
This is actually remind me of another case our sources mentioned, Pensie's Supply.
Oh, interesting case. That involved a company that received a free product.
Yeah, who doesn't love free stuff?
Right.
What's the harm?
Well, here's the catch. Disposing of this free product ended up costing the receiving company a significant amount of money.
Oh, no.
It turned out to be a costly freebie.
Wow. So even though there weren't any explicit negotiations or money exchange for the product itself, it still created a binding agreement.
Right. The court recognized that even though there wasn't classic bargaining over this free product, the give and get was still there.
Okay.
One company got rid of something they didn't want, and the other company got something that seemed free but came with unforeseen costs.
Right.
This exchange, this unspoken give and get, was enough to be considered a contract.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a cautionary tale about free stuff.
It really is.
It really highlights how consideration can exist even in situations that don't look like your typical business deal, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to another really crucial element of consideration.
Okay.
Intent to contract.
Okay.
It's not enough to just have an exchange, right?
Yeah.
Both sides need to understand that they are entering into a legally binding agreement.
So it's about more than just the letter of the law.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about the spirit of the agreement.
That is.
Like, did both sides genuinely believe that they were creating a contract?
Yeah.
Like, with legal consequences?
Precisely. And that can get really, really tricky.
Okay.
A perfect example is the case of Cohen v. Cowles Media,
Oh, yeah.
where a source for a news story was promised anonymity but was later revealed.
Oh, man, that case always makes me think twice about trusting a promise.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. It raises a lot of interesting questions about when a moral obligation transforms into a legal one.
Right.
In this case, the court really had to grapple with whether that promise of anonymity was intended to be legally binding or just a moral assurance.
And what did they conclude?
They ended up siding with the source, highlighting that even in situations where there's no exchange of money or goods, a promise can still have legal weight.
Okay.
If it was clear that both sides intended to create a binding contract.
So it's like, if I promise my friend a ride and then bail, that's not a contract because hopefully we never intended for there to be legal consequences, right?
Right.
But if I'm a business owner and I'm like making promises to a client, then that intent to contract is kind of implied.
That's a great way to put it. Context matters.
Yeah.
And the law tries to take a reasonable approach when determining what the parties intended.
This is all making me realize how much we just take contracts for granted.
Yeah.
And our sources mention another interesting wrinkle.
Okay.
Nominal consideration.
Okay.
Does that mean you could sell something like, say, a rare first edition book for $1?
Uh-huh.
and call it a legally binding contract?
You're definitely catching up. You've stumbled onto the fascinating world of nominal consideration,
Okay.
where the value exchanged is almost symbolic.
Okay.
Like your dollar for a rare book. Yeah.
Courts often look at the existence of an exchange,
Okay.
rather than getting bogged down in the fair market value.
So it's almost like saying, hey, we both know this book is worth way more than $1,
Right.
but this dollar proves we intended to create a contract.
Exactly. A great illustration is the case of Thomas v. Thomas,
Okay.
where a widow was allowed to live in a house in exchange for a tiny annual payment.
Wow.
The court's point was that the small payment, while not equal to market rent,
Yeah.
demonstrated a clear exchange and upheld the agreement as a contract.
That's incredible. It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But I guess it goes back to that idea that consideration is about the existence of an exchange.
Yes.
Not necessarily its fairness, in a purely economic sense.
It's important to remember that there are always exceptions, and other legal doctrines might come into play.
Right.
But the key takeaway is that even a small symbolic exchange can carry legal weight if both parties intended to create a binding agreement.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener for me.
I never realized how much this, seemingly obscure legal concept actually plays a role in our everyday lives.
Yeah. It's everywhere once you start to see it. From
Right.
clicking I agree to online terms of service, to
Right.
signing a lease, even buying a cup of coffee.
Wow.
Consideration is like the invisible thread holding those agreements together.
It's like all that fine print we never read but probably should.
Right.
So to wrap things up here, let's give our listeners something to really chew on.
Okay.
We've covered what consideration is, we've covered how it works,
Right.
but why should anyone care?
That's the million-dollar question. It's not about memorizing legal jargon, right? It's about empowering yourself.
Okay.
Understanding consideration gives you a superpower.
Okay.
The ability to analyze agreements, spot potential issues, and
Right.
protect yourself from entering into something that you might later regret.
So it's like that saying knowledge is power, but in this case it's like legal knowledge is negotiating power.
Exactly. It's about going into agreements with your eyes wide open.
I love it. So for our listeners out there, here's the challenge for you.
Okay.
Think about a recent agreement you've made. Maybe something simple like borrowing in a neighbor's lawnmower or splitting the cost of takeout with a friend.
Okay.
Was there an element of consideration there?
Yeah.
That give and get, even if it was unspoken?
Right?
You might be surprised how often this legal principle pops up in our everyday interactions.
It really does.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But until next time, keep those contracts airtight.